They called it a joke before they ever feared it. In briefing rooms across Germany and Japan, the P-47 Thunderbolt was spoken of with a confidence that bordered on dismissal. The question circulating through enemy command was simple. How could a fighter that heavy, that large, and that slow to climb ever threaten the elite aces of the Axis? The arrogance was firm, built on early reports and long-standing assumptions. And because no one challenged those assumptions, the danger behind them went unnoticed. The setup of the air war reinforced this confidence. Axis pilots had shaped the skies for years with fast climbing, highly maneuverable machines that rewarded precision and aggression. Doctrine centered on speed as a weapon and altitude as a shield. Against that backdrop, the Thunderbolt looked like a mistake. Too bulky to excel, too heavy to contest the vertical space, too unrefined to survive long fights. Intelligence boards sketched it as an afterthought, a machine that would fall behind the moment pressure increased. To commanders accustomed to dominance, the P-47 seemed more burden than threat. This certainty fed into their tactics. German and Japanese pilots trained to exploit weakness the moment they sensed it. A fighter that struggled to climb, trap it from above. A machine that carried heavy weight, force tight turns, make it bleed energy, then strike. These tactics had worked against countless opponents. There was no reason, they believed, that the Thunderbolt would break the pattern. Confidence came easily when every past engagement supported it. Rising tension began with the first field observations. Radar teams in Europe and the Pacific started reporting climb rates and dive paths that did not match the expected performance charts. Spotters noted formations of P-47s arriving at altitudes that should have been difficult for them to reach quickly. The reports were brief and factual, but they sparked quiet questions among analysts. Had the Americans altered the design? Were pilots pushing the aircraft differently than predicted? Nothing was confirmed, but the numbers hinted at something commanders did not want to consider. The Thunderbolt might not be operating within the limits they assumed. The contrast grew sharper when pilots in the field mentioned fleeting moments that didn't fit the narrative. A heavy fighter holding altitude longer than expected. A supposed slow climber reaching the fight sooner than calculations allowed. Isolated events, easily ignored, but each one chipped away at the confidence surrounding Axis doctrine. Still, the belief held strong, arrogance masking the shift beneath the surface. The idea that the P-47 could challenge them felt absurd, and dismissing the threat was easier than analyzing it. But the pressure point was forming. The enemy had misread more than an aircraft. They had misread a developing system behind it. American engineering philosophy, pilot training, and mission planning were beginning to shape how the Thunderbolt behaved in the sky. Yet none of this reached the commanders who believed they already understood the fight. Their arrogance became a shield against reality, and that shield weakened with every new observation they failed to explain. The stakes of this misjudgment stretched far beyond a single aircraft. The Axis air forces were preparing for a continued struggle built on careful control of performance advantages. If those advantages were fading, even slightly, the cost would come later, and it would come sharply. The P-47, dismissed with laughter and confidence, was already laying the groundwork for a moment of humiliation the Axis never expected to face. The Thunderbolt had entered the war underestimated. It would not stay that way for long. Axis command had built its confidence on a simple assumption. If a fighter looked heavy, it would fly heavy. The P-47 Thunderbolt fit that assumption perfectly. Its wide fuselage, large engine housing, and imposing frame suggested a machine that would struggle in the fast, precise arena of modern air combat. Yet this judgment was made from a distance, without understanding the intent behind its creation. The Americans had not designed a beauty. They had designed a weapon built to dominate a specific kind of war. The setup for that intent began with altitude. U.S. Engineers wanted a fighter that could climb into the high air corridors where bombers traveled and where interception lines formed. They built around a massive engine and a turbo supercharger system meant to hold power long after other aircraft faded. Durability came next. The Thunderbolt carried armor, redundant systems, and structural thickness that seemed excessive, until the war revealed why it mattered. And then there was firepower. 8 .50 caliber guns gave it a punch few fighters could absorb. Every choice had purpose, but none of that purpose was visible to an enemy, focused only on shape and size. This misread became the core tension. Axis analysts dismissed the Thunderbolt because it did not look like a threat under their doctrine. Their fighters were sleek, agile, and designed for turning battles. The P-47 looked like it belonged in another category entirely. They judged by silhouette, not mission. By appearance, not application. And because they underestimated the mission, they underestimated the machine. Revelation came from the first confirmed survival reports. Japanese and German pilots returned from engagements with stories that raised eyebrows in command. The P-47 taking direct hits that would tear through most fighters, yet continuing to fight. Crews saw Thunderbolts trailing smoke, leaking fluids, sometimes losing entire panels of skin, but still climbing, still diving, still shooting back. The early assumption had been that the aircraft was too heavy to endure long fights. Reality showed the opposite. The weight was strength, not weakness. This created a question that unsettled frontline intelligence teams. How is it still flying? The Thunderbolt's ability to survive punishment contradicted every expectation. Even high-velocity cannon rounds failed to bring it down as often as they should have. Reports showed P-47s limping home from distances that seemed impossible. The aircraft that was mocked for its bulk now revealed that bulk as a shield. As these patterns repeated, cracks appeared in the enemy narrative. The Axis could no longer frame the Thunderbolt as a slow, unthreatening platform. Each new engagement introduced evidence that it behaved differently than expected. It climbed stronger at altitude. It maintained power where others faded. It endured damage that should have ended the fight. And with each shift, the initial confidence that dismissed the P-47 became harder to defend. The escalation came when commanders compared these observations to their doctrine. Axis fighters relied on speed, maneuverability, and precision. But those strengths mattered less if their weapons could not finish the job. A fighter that refused to die disrupted every tactic built around decisive strikes. The Thunderbolt's presence alone forced pilots to adjust, rethink, and retreat from engagements they once dominated. Misreading its design philosophy had weakened the entire strategic foundation. The consequence was subtle but dangerous. Planning that relied on predictable enemy weaknesses began to falter. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. Axis Command understood that the Americans had built a fighter for a different kind of war. One fought with altitude, durability, and overwhelming firepower. And because that mission had been ignored in early assessments, the cost would only grow as the P-47's true role unfolded. The aircraft they mocked was becoming the aircraft they feared. The first encounters played out under familiar conditions. Axis pilots approached with confidence, expecting the same pattern they had seen in earlier reports. The P-47, heavy and slow to climb, should have avoided vertical engagements. Doctrine said these Thunderbolts would stay level, evade pressure by turning away, and look for safety rather than confrontation. That assumption shaped every maneuver the Axis initiated. They believed they already knew the outcome before the fight began, but the script broke the moment contact was made. Instead of retreating from high-altitude threats, the Thunderbolts responded with sudden, crushing dives. The speed shocked even experienced pilots. A fighter labeled, "too heavy to move fast," accelerated with a force that tore apart the timing of German and Japanese tactics. Pilots expecting an easy chase found the P-47 dropping out of reach in seconds, building velocity neither side had planned for. The rules they relied on no longer applied. Observation teams noted this shift immediately. Radio logs captured the tension. Thunderbolts were not avoiding vertical space. They were owning it. Their dives carried momentum that flipped the fight. Instead of fleeing, they used the descent to strike with precision. Enemy pilots who believed they controlled the vertical ladder suddenly found themselves outpaced, outrun and outgunned. The sight of a P-47 diving from altitude with guns blazing did not match any expectation written into Axis instruction manuals. Rising tension grew as frontline pilots reported a second unexpected pattern the P-47 refused to break. Under pressure, heavy fighters usually faltered, widening gaps and losing energy. But Thunderbolt formations held steady even when Axis aces attacked aggressively. Their stability under fire created confusion. The refusal to peel off or surrender angles signaled a level of confidence that Japan and Germany had not prepared for. The aircraft they mocked for being unwieldy was now showing discipline and control in moments that demanded precision. Then came the aggression. Instead of defensive flight, P-47 pilots pressed forward. They turned into attacks with a willingness that unsettled opponents defined by finesse and maneuver. Axis pilots felt the shift at a psychological level. Engagements that once favored their lighter, agile fighters now spiraled into unpredictable exchanges where the Thunderbolt's mass, speed, and firepower dictated the next move. This aggression defied traditional logic. It was not how a heavy fighter was supposed to behave. The realization struck fast. This is not how heavy fighters behave. The line appeared repeatedly in mission debriefs. The P-47 wasn't playing the role assigned to it. It wasn't slow, hesitant, or easy to trap. It was becoming the unpredictable force in the sky, forcing the Axis to reevaluate tactics built on decades of assumptions. The humiliation came not from defeat, but from misjudgment. They had dismissed a machine they barely understood. That pressure point widened with every encounter. The old tactics, once reliable and clean, stopped working. High-angle traps failed. Climbing ambushes failed. Energy depletion maneuvers failed. Each failure chipped away at confidence. The Thunderbolt's dives broke engagement lines. Its refusal to break shattered expectations. Its aggression rewrote the timing of combat itself. For ace pilots who prided themselves on mastery, this shift was more disruptive than a loss. It was a challenge to everything they believed about air combat. Command centers felt the confusion spreading across the front. Reports conflicted with earlier intelligence. Performance metrics contradicted doctrine. The aircraft that was supposed to be predictable had become the variable no one could control. The stakes rose quickly as planning models began to fracture. Without reliable assumptions, no tactic could be trusted. The axis of superiority tilted, not through a single blow, but through repeated moments where the Thunderbolt acted outside every rule the Axis understood. The battles were still early, but their meaning was clear. The P-47 had broken the script, and the enemy no longer knew how to read the sky. Axis pilots entered the engagement certain they held the advantage. The P-47 might fly straight and hit hard, but in the vertical realm, they believed it could never compete. Their fighters were lighter, faster to react, built to dominate climbs and plunges with precision. In their minds, a Thunderbolt caught above its comfort zone was a guaranteed victory. That confidence shaped every move as they closed in. They expected hesitation. They expected retreat. What they met instead was the moment that changed the air war. The setup looked routine. Elite Axis fighters positioned themselves for a punishing descent, ready to trap the P-47 below them. But as they committed to the attack, rising tension revealed something wrong. The Thunderbolt did not pull away. It didn't flatten out or try to outrun the attack path. It pointed downward and committed to a dive so sharp, so sudden, that the Axis pilots overshot their timing before they understood what had happened. A machine they mocked for being heavy had just disappeared into a descent too fast for them to follow. The decisive reveal unfolded in seconds. The P-47 didn't simply dive. It dropped with a force that created a physical gap no Axis fighter could close. The elite pursuers, men trained to dominate through vertical control, pushed their aircraft to match the descent. It didn't matter. Their machines vibrated, strained, and neared structural limits. The Thunderbolt stayed smooth, stable, and impossibly fast. The gap widened until the pursuers were no longer hunters. They were spectators. Then came the moment that burned humiliation into the record. At the bottom of the dive, the Thunderbolt leveled, swung its guns around, and fired with destructive clarity. The elite pilots, who had begun the chase with confidence, were vaporized in the counterattack. The speed advantage they believed was theirs had turned into a trap they never saw coming. Observers on the ground and in trailing aircraft watched the sequence, stunned. It was not a tactical misstep. It was physics, raw, undeniable physics, that favored the P-47. That realization spread with alarming speed. Intelligence teams replayed the numbers, recalculated angles, and examined performance charts. Every analysis reached the same point. The P-47's dive speed existed in a range their fighters could not enter. It wasn't about skill. It wasn't about luck. It was about structural and aerodynamic limits they could not change. One line began repeating through Axis command rooms as officers compared footage and reports. We can't stop that. The fear escalated from that single truth. If the P-47 controlled the dive, it controlled the fight. The axis of engagement shifted from horizontal turning battles to vertical momentum battles. And in that world, the Thunderbolt ruled. Old tactics unraveled instantly. Pursuit doctrines failed. Ambush patterns collapsed. Even elite pilots trained to exploit high-speed descents now faced a weapon that outpaced them at their own specialty. The humiliation came from the simplicity of the shift, the maneuver they once used to dominate had become the maneuver that exposed them. Consequences rippled through strategic planning. Commanders realized they had to rewrite their approach to the air war. No amount of experience could overcome a physics gap that placed their aircraft at a permanent disadvantage. The P-47's dive advantage wasn't a minor feature. It was a battlefield-shaping force, a tool that let American pilots choose when to fight and when to vanish. For an air force built on control and precision, losing the vertical domain was not a setback. It was a turning point. The dive that changed everything did more than claim a few aces. It shattered a belief system. The enemy could no longer rely on the sky behaving the way it used to. The Thunderbolt had introduced a new rule, and from that moment forward, every Axis pilot understood the danger waiting above them. Enemy pilots first noticed it in the most unsettling way possible. Their bullets were hitting, but nothing was happening. At first, they assumed poor angles or rushed firing, but as more engagements unfolded, the same pattern repeated. The P-47 Thunderbolt was absorbing punishment that should have torn it apart. The hook was immediate and chilling. For an air force built on precision strikes and clean kills, watching rounds vanish into a fighter that refused to fall created a sense of dread they could not ignore. The setup came through debrief records filled with disbelief. Aces who prided themselves on accuracy described long bursts at close range, shots that would cripple most aircraft, only to watch the Thunderbolt continue flying as if nothing vital had been hit. Armor plating, layered systems, and sheer mass created a shield far beyond anything the Axis expected. What they saw in the sky no longer matched the doctrine they taught in classrooms. A heavy fighter wasn't supposed to endure like this. Escalation followed quickly. Pilots who once opened attacks with confidence began hesitating. Reports described P-47s returning to base covered in holes, leaking fluids, missing control surfaces, and still managing to complete their missions. Even when severely damaged, the Thunderbolt held together long enough to escape or strike back. In contrast, the Axis fighters, light, agile, and optimized for performance, broke apart under similar hits. The imbalance became painfully clear. One machine could survive mistakes, the other could not. Each failed kill attempt chipped away at ace confidence. Axis pilots relied on the belief that their skill could overcome any opponent. But when perfect shots failed to deliver results, that belief began to collapse. Veterans who once trusted their instincts now questioned their ability to end fights decisively. Their frustration showed in mission logs filled with phrases like, "should have gone down," "impossible durability," and "still climbing after multiple hits." The sky they once controlled was turning hostile in a way skill alone could not fix. The shocking reveal came from a series of confrontations where entire squadrons focused their fire on a single P-47, only to watch it escape or counterattack with full force. The Thunderbolt's durability wasn't just an engineering trait, it was a psychological weapon. The knowledge that their shots might not matter created hesitation, and hesitation in combat meant death. The P-47 broke the rhythm of Axis tactics by refusing to die on time. The contrast between machines now defined every engagement. Axis fighters were designed like scalpels. Sharp, precise, lethal in skilled hands, but fragile under sustained pressure. The Thunderbolt was a hammer, dense, armored, and brutally hard to stop. When a scalpel met a hammer at high speed, the outcome was no longer predictable. That uncertainty shook pilots, who built their careers on confidence. Then came the realization that spread through the ranks. With the weight of finality, skill alone won't beat this machine. For the first time, Axis aces faced an opponent whose survival didn't depend on perfect flying. The P-47 could make mistakes and recover. They couldn't. The psychological impact was immediate. A fighter that wouldn't fall stripped pilots of the one advantage they always relied on: the ability to force outcomes through precision. Now, precision wasn't enough. The consequence stretched far beyond individual battles. The collapse of traditional dominance doctrine meant Axis pilots had to fight in a world where aggression no longer guaranteed victory. Their tactics, built on fragile aircraft and decisive strikes, were losing relevance. The Thunderbolt had rewritten the cost of engagement. Every shot at it risked failure. Every mistake they made risked death. Durability became dominance. And in the silence between battles, Axis Command realized the horror of it. They were facing a machine designed to survive the exact war they were fighting, and their own aircraft were not. The shift in American pilot behavior began quietly, almost unnoticed, as the P-47 evolved from a misunderstood fighter into a weapon pilots trusted with their lives. The early uncertainty that shaped U.S. air crews faded with each engagement. As Thunderbolts survived hits that would destroy other aircraft and delivered kills that shocked the enemy, a new mindset took root. The Americans no longer entered battles cautiously. They entered with intent. The setup for this transformation became clear. Confidence was turning into a tactical force of its own. Axis doctrine had always relied on triggering fear responses, forcing opponents to break formation, retreat early, or hesitate under pressure. But when American pilots realized the vertical domain now belonged to them, everything changed. They began flying with fearless aggression, diving and climbing through combat zones with an authority that Axis pilots did not expect. Instead of avoiding high-risk maneuvers, they embraced them. The P-47's power and durability allowed moves that would be suicidal in lighter aircraft, and the pilots leaned into that advantage with growing certainty. The mindset contrast deepened in every engagement. Where Axis pilots anticipated defensive reactions, they found Americans turning into the fight. Where they expected hesitation, they encountered firm control. When they attempted to intimidate, the Thunderbolt pilots countered with steady, organized aggression. The assumption that Americans would break first. The assumption that had shaped years of Axis tactical planning collapsed under the weight of repeated failure. The enemy had become immune to tactics that once secured victory. Escalation followed as U.S. pilot discipline sharpened instead of fraying. The Thunderbolt crews began to move as unified units rather than scattered individuals. Under heavy fire, their formations held. Under sudden ambush, they coordinated responses with speed that surprised observers. Reports from Axis intelligence teams noted that the Americans were learning to fight without hesitation, a phrase that carried the weight of a growing threat. The discipline was not emotional. It was structural, born from survival, reinforced by success. This psychological edge became clearer when Axis pilots attempted to reassert dominance. Pushes that once broke weaker opponents now met resistance. Attempts to climb above the P-47s failed. Attempts to force them into tight turns only opened opportunities for Thunderbolt dives. Every failed tactic fed American confidence further. In the mind versus mind contest, the Americans were gaining momentum. Thunderbolt pilots no longer viewed themselves as underdogs. They viewed themselves as hunters. The realization moment struck Axis command as they analyzed the cumulative pattern. The Americans had become fighters who did not fear the engagements they used to avoid. Their machines could take punishment. Their tactics favored aggression. Their mindset rejected intimidation. And, most dangerously, they operated with the calm focus of pilots who trusted their aircraft to protect them in the worst conditions. Japan and Germany had built their strategies around breaking the will of their opponents. But the P-47 pilots had rebuilt their will around surviving and dominating the fight. The consequence of this psychological shift reshaped the war's air dynamics. Axis forces lost their leverage. Without the ability to intimidate or unbalance opponents, their entire psychological strategy weakened. Engagements became harder, longer, and more dangerous. Ace pilots who once controlled the tempo now faced opponents who absorbed fear and returned it with force. Thunderbolt crews brought a new kind of pressure, one that combined engineering power with mental resilience. By the time this shift was fully understood, it was too late to counter. The Americans had developed a mindset that matched the strength of their machines. And in the sky, where confidence could shape survival as much as skill, that mindset became one of the most decisive advantages of the war. They sent their best to prove a point. The Axis command chose elite aces, pilots with long victory lists, unmatched instincts, and reputations built on years of dominance, to confront what they still called the heavy joke. The mission carried an unspoken message: show the Americans their luck had limits. But as the aces climbed toward the incoming Thunderbolts, a tension formed beneath the surface. Reports from previous battles hinted at changes no one wanted to acknowledge. Still, pride pushed them forward. They believed skill would settle everything. The tension sharpened the moment they made visual contact. The P-47s approached in tight formation, steady and unafraid, their presence in the sky heavier than their frames. The aces expected a simple sequence: pressure, break, pursuit, kill. It had worked countless times before. They initiated the first moves flawlessly, diving from a superior angle and tightening the noose around the Thunderbolts. But the P-47s did not react with the usual signs of distress. They did not scatter. They did not climb away in panic. Instead, they positioned themselves for maneuvers that no heavy fighter should have been able to execute. The confrontation broke the rhythm of everything the aces trusted. As the Axis fighters attempted to push the Thunderbolts into a defensive spiral, the P-47s shifted into synchronized dives. The surge of speed was instantaneous and overwhelming. The Americans turned their weight into momentum, their engines roaring into a descent no Axis machine could duplicate. The aces followed out of instinct, trying to control the vertical chase, but the gap widened with every second. The Thunderbolts weren't fleeing. They were setting the trap. At the bottom of the dive, the moment of collapse arrived. The P-47s pulled up with clean, brutal power, rolling into firing positions that caught the pursuing aces exposed. The synergy of maneuver and firepower struck with surgical brutality. 8 50-caliber guns erupted in tight, controlled bursts. Axis aircraft that once symbolized dominance broke apart under the weight of rounds they couldn't outrun, outclimb, or outmaneuver. One ace fell, then another, then another. Years of mastery vanished in seconds, erased by a machine they had mocked and a tactic they never believed it could perform. Command units watching from the ground and monitoring radios heard the panic bleed through the fragments of communication. Calls for support and reports of cascading losses. And then silence, the kind that follows when veterans who never lose suddenly do. In war rooms across 2 continents, observers stared at the data coming in. Numbers that did not make sense, patterns that overturned doctrine. Their best pilots, men who shaped the early air war, had been outflown and destroyed by an aircraft they dismissed. The realization settled with devastating clarity. Dominance was gone. The Axis method of relying on elite pilots to compensate for structural disadvantages no longer worked. Aces couldn't outthink the Thunderbolt's power dive. They couldn't outshoot its firepower. They couldn't outlast its durability. Everything that once defined superiority had been inverted. Stakes exploded as command teams recalculated the broader impact. Without their elite pilots, the Axis lost the backbone of its air capability. Veteran leadership evaporated. Tactical knowledge died with the men who carried it. Morale cracked in places where confidence had once been unshakable, and replacing those aces was impossible. Their training pipeline couldn't rebuild that kind of experience. The Americans, however, had pilots arriving in waves. The consequence was immediate and irreversible. The fall of the aces marked more than a tactical defeat. It marked the turning of the strategic balance. From this day forward, every Axis pilot who entered the sky did so with the knowledge that the Thunderbolt, not their own machines, held the advantage. Fear replaced arrogance. Doubt replaced confidence. The air war had crossed a line it would never return from. Axis command entered this phase of the war expecting turbulence, not crisis. The loss of their elite aces had been a shock, but leadership clung to the belief that revised tactics could restore balance. They ordered adjustments, rewrote engagement protocols, and reassigned veteran pilots to stabilize the front. But as the next waves of combat unfolded, the setup for collapse emerged with brutal clarity. Nothing worked the way it once had. The P-47 had rewritten the sky, and Axis strategy could not follow. Tension rose as field reports arrived with patterns too consistent to ignore. Tactics that had been reliable for years, high-angle ambushes, coordinated climbs, precision strikes, now failed with disturbing regularity. Thunderbolts dove out of traps, punched through defensive lines, and shattered formations designed to catch lighter aircraft. Pilots reported that their maneuvers felt outdated before the battles even began. The battlefield had changed shape, and Axis doctrine was trapped in an older war. Intelligence units tried to explain the failures, but their findings only deepened the dread. They documented the P-47's unmatched dive speed, its ability to absorb punishment, its firepower concentration, and its growing presence across multiple fronts. The Americans were not fielding an occasional advantage. They were fielding a system built on endurance, scale, and mechanical superiority. These reports clashed violently with the assumptions held inside leadership circles. Commanders who once spoke with certainty now faced data that stripped their confidence away, one line at a time. Collapse indicators multiplied as each battle revealed the same grim sequence. Axis pilots attempted to force engagements using time-tested patterns. The P-47 used its speed and durability to reverse those patterns. German and Japanese fighters tried to dictate altitude. The Thunderbolt seized it. They tried to exhaust the Americans. The Americans arrived with fresh pilots and superior machines. The Axis Air Forces had always relied on skill compensating for limits. Now those limits were exposed, stretched, and broken in every direction. Then came the realization that froze entire command rooms. This wasn't a tactical defeat. It was structural. Their entire air doctrine, built on agility, elite training, and precise maneuver, could not counter the Thunderbolt's combination of power, survivability, and mass deployment. The Americans had created a machine that neutralized traditional strengths and exploited traditional weaknesses. Intelligence officers summarized the truth with a phrase that spread across internal reports like a warning flare. We cannot counter this system. That pressure point marked the moment denial ended. The Axis command understood that no adjustment in pilot behavior, no minor technical upgrade, and no new tactic could reverse the curve now bending against them. They were operating inside an air war shaped by American engineering and American industry. Forces too large, too flexible, and too relentless to contain. The psychological weight of that realization deepened the crisis. Leaders who once planned offensives now calculated losses. Strategists who once pushed for aggression now argued only for survival. Consequences began spreading beyond the cockpit. Without reliable air control, ground offensives weakened. Supply routes became vulnerable. Naval operations lost critical air cover. Entire campaigns shifted direction because the Axis no longer controlled the altitude that once gave them dominance. The war's momentum tilted toward the Allies, not through a single decisive blow, but through countless engagements where the Thunderbolt dictated the terms and the Axis could only react. By the end of this chapter in the war, command panic had replaced command authority. Tactical collapse had replaced tactical confidence, and the air war's outcome had begun shifting in a way no strategy could reverse. The Axis had lost more than pilots and planes. They had lost the foundation of their power in the sky. The evidence had become too overwhelming to ignore. Axis command, once confident in its understanding of the air war, entered this stage with a grim acceptance. The P-47's superiority was not accidental, not situational, and not temporary. It was systemic. The setup for this realization came through wave after wave of reports showing the same pattern. Thunderbolts controlling altitude, surviving damage, dictating engagement tempo, and flying with a mindset sharpened by a growing sense of invincibility. No single factor explained the dominance. It was the convergence of all of them. The synthesis revealed the true shape of the threat. Engineering had given the P-47 unmatched durability, high-altitude power, and lethal fire output. Pilot mindset had evolved into steady aggression, born from trust in a machine that rarely failed them. And training scale ensured that these advantages multiplied, not faded. America wasn't fielding a rare elite unit. It was fielding an ecosystem designed to produce capable pilots in numbers the Axis could never match. This structure worked as one engine of supremacy, each part reinforcing the next. As this understanding spread, escalation hit at the tactical level. Axis fighters, once able to dictate the terms of battle, found themselves reacting to a new environment controlled entirely by the Thunderbolt's strengths. Vertical space belonged to the P-47. High-speed zones belonged to the P-47. Extended engagements favored the P-47. Even damage resistance tilted every fight toward the Americans. Pilots entering combat now understood that the tactical environment itself had shifted. It was shaped by U.S. engineering and strategy, not by Axis doctrine. Their familiar pathways to victory were closing. The realization moment struck with the weight of finality. Command leaders understood that dominance was no longer contestable. The P-47 had become more than a fighter. It was the centerpiece of a system that outpaced Axis capabilities in every measurable category. Engineers could not redesign their planes fast enough. Training schools could not produce enough replacements. Tactical adaptations could not overcome structural disadvantages. The Thunderbolt's superiority was not a high point in the war. It was a permanent feature of the new air landscape. With this realization came psychological defeat. Pilots who once carried the pride of early victories now flew with the knowledge that they faced an opponent engineered to outperform them, trained to outlast them, and supported by an industrial force they could not rival. Fear replaced bravado. Defensive flying replaced aggression. The confidence that once defined Axis air power dissolved as the Thunderbolt carved out a space where their tactics no longer applied. Dominance had changed sides, and it was not coming back. The consequences spread across the strategic map. The war's air balance had been rewritten. Allied bombing campaigns grew more protected. Ground units advanced with stronger cover. Supply lines stayed open while Axis routes shrank. Every front felt the pressure of losing control of the sky. The P-47 did not end the war by itself, but it reshaped the conditions under which the war would end. Its ecosystem of strength turned the air war into a contest the Axis could no longer influence. By the time this understanding reached every level of command, the outcome was clear. The Thunderbolt represented not just a superior aircraft, but a superior system, one that dictated the war's trajectory and ensured the momentum would never swing back. The final picture of the air war cannot be understood without tracing the Axis collapse back to a single defining shift: the arrival of the P-47 Thunderbolt and the system that stood behind it. When historians review the long arc of the conflict, they see the same progression. Early Axis dominance gave way to confusion, then to shock, then to structural defeat. The Thunderbolt did not win every battle, but it reshaped the conditions under which every battle was fought. The recap is stark. Once the P-47 gained momentum, the Axis air forces never regained control. The consequences of its strengths rippled through every front. Axis fighters that once dictated altitude found themselves pushed downward. Their best aces, men who once held the sky with precision and fearlessness, fell to tactics and firepower they had not been trained to face. Their doctrines, built on light frames and high maneuverability, collapsed against a fighter engineered to dive faster, hit harder, and survive longer. The P-47's durability alone forced a rethinking of kill strategies. Its firepower shattered formations with a reliability the Axis could not match, and its pilots, backed by large-scale training pipelines, arrived with growing confidence as the Thunderbolt proved itself again and again. This shaped the legacy that followed. The United States had built more than a fighter. It had built an air ecosystem. Engineering teams pushing rapid upgrades, factories producing machines in overwhelming numbers, and training programs turning novices into effective combat pilots at a pace unmatched anywhere else in the world. Where Axis aircraft reached the limits of their design, the P-47 kept evolving. Where Axis pilot pools shrank, American numbers surged. And where Axis command struggled to adapt to a changing air environment, the U.S. adapted continuously, feeding lessons from every engagement into the next. The contrast between adaptation and stagnation defined the later years of the war. Germany and Japan clung to aircraft concepts that once brought victory, but no longer matched the demands of a shifting battlefield. Their limited industrial capacity and rigid training systems left them unable to respond to the Thunderbolt's rise. Meanwhile, America's willingness to scale, adjust, and innovate turned the P-47 into a symbol of a broader strategic truth in modern warfare. Superiority comes from systems, not single machines. The final realization speaks with historical clarity. The Thunderbolt's advantage was not a lucky breakthrough or a temporary imbalance. It was structural. It was embedded in the way the United States built, trained, supplied, and adapted throughout the war. That structure made the P-47 not only a powerful tool, but an unavoidable shift in the balance of air power. The Axis did not lose because their pilots were unskilled or their early aircraft were poor. They lost because the fundamentals of their air strategy could not match the industrial, psychological, and tactical ecosystem that produced the Thunderbolt. As the war moved toward its end, the P-47's legacy became clear in every escort mission, every ground attack operation, and every high-altitude engagement. It stood as proof that dominance in the sky belongs to those who anticipate change, not those who rely on past superiority. In that sense, the Thunderbolt did more than reshape the conflict. It reshaped the very definition of air supremacy.